Good afternoon, everyone. It is 12 o'clock noon here in Washington, D.C., where I'm based. It's 9 o'clock on the West Coast and 11 o'clock in Chicago, where our guest is. I'm Chip Gibbons, Policy Director of Defending Rights and Dissent. Defending Rights and Dissent is an organization that defends your right to know and freedom to act. And as a result, for the last 13 years, we have been following the trial and persecution of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. I was looking through our archives this morning before coming on, and I pulled up a newsletter from December 2010 we published, whose lead story was the campaign against WikiLeaks. And in the newsletter, we warn about how terrible it would be for Eric Holder to indict Assange or WikiLeaks under the Espionage Act. 13 years later, the Trump administration had indicted Julian Assange. The Biden administration is continuing the persecution, and after today's ruling, we are one step closer to having Julian Assange brought to the U.S. to stand trial for the grievous act of exposing U.S. war crimes. What is the meaning of today's ruling, and what are the next steps? To discuss this issue, we're joined again by Kevin Gosztola. Kevin is the managing editor of Shadowproof, the curator of the Dissenter. He covered the Chelsea Manning court-martial as well as the Julian Assange extradition hearing. He has a new book coming out in 2023 called Guilty of Journalism, from Seven Stories and Censored Press. Kevin, we're very happy to have you here today.
It's good to talk with you, Chip.
So earlier this morning, a UK magistrate gave an extradition order for Julian Assange to the US. Could you explain, for people who haven't followed this case, what is the significance of today's order and what comes next?
Yeah, and I think that's probably going to be the biggest question on people's minds. What happens next? So that can be pretty easily answered. The order from the British court has gone to the Home Office, where Home Secretary Priti Patel will be reviewing the extradition request. And if there are no improprieties found within the extradition request, then it will be approved. Then the stamp of approval will go back to the Westminster Magistrate Court, which is the British court that signed off on this order. And then that extradition could move forward. But what's expected is that there will be an appeal from Julian Assange's legal team, and that appeal will involve fundamental issues, especially the ones that have been at stake in this case, but we haven't seen litigated yet, because there was this decision back on January 4th, 2021 by District Judge Vanessa Baretzer, who has since moved on and is no longer with the Westminster Court. But she upheld many of the allegations, or found that there was basis for virtually all of the allegations against the WikiLeaks founder. And so these things that are a threat to press freedom are now going to be something that his legal team can challenge after the Home Office is done with it. So presuming that it's approved, and there are many political reasons why we can act as if it will be approved, even though now is the moment to make it a political issue and challenge what happens next. But then it'll come back and there will be another appeal of the Home Office's handling of this, as well as the way that the courts have handled the request. And it'll involve the extradition treaty and how you heard Stella Assange say today that this treaty has not been applied appropriately, because there's supposed to be an exemption for political offenses. If somebody's accused of a political offense like Julian Assange, then they are not to be extradited to that requesting state. The requesting state.
Yeah. International law textbook you look at when it mentions the political questions doctrine, which has historically been a complex doctrine, but there's a very clear-cut part of the doctrine where there are pure or absolute political offenses, and those are espionage, treason, and sedition. The issue of relative political offenses, when a crime in one case might not be a political offense, is in another case, is an extraordinary complex area of jurisprudence. But the issue of pure or absolute or classic political offenses, whatever, I'm blanking on what I learned in law school, are and have always been, since this doctrine came about, espionage, treason, and sedition. And Julian Assange faces 17 counts. 17 counts under the Espionage Act, which, if you were following an international law textbook, would be precluded from extradition. There would then be a fight about the remaining charge, about whether or not it was a relative political offense in this. But I just want to be clear. Not extraditing someone for espionage is a pretty big principle of international extradition, and it makes sense because otherwise Putin would, file an extradition request for a bunch of people in Langley, and we're not going to send them over. Countries don't turn over their own spies, or spies in general. Of course, Assange is not guilty of spying; he's guilty of journalism, which this heightens the political nature of this persecution. But I do want to hammer home that espionage is a classic political offense. And I do want to back you up a little bit, Kevin, because you mentioned we can assume this will be approved. But I do want people watching or listening to know that at this point, we now begin a 4-week process during which the British Crown Prosecution Services, representing the U.S. Justice Department, will give submissions saying, yes, you should extradite Assange, and Assange's legal team and legal defense will give their own submissions over the next 4 weeks, arguing that the extradition order should not be upheld or not given. What do we know about Priti Patel? You've written about some of her views on state secrets in your dissenter piece this morning, which I don't know if that one's behind a paywall or not, but
no, it's available. It's available.
So, but what do we know about her?
Yeah, and first, let me recommend that people read declassifieduk.org. This is a group of journalists in the United Kingdom. Matt Kennard is the chief investigator over there. I interviewed him earlier for Shadowproof at the Shadowproof YouTube. And they've done excellent work looking at Priti Patel, the Home Office, these officials. I believe his name is Sajid Javid. Sajid Javid was a Home Office secretary before Priti Patel. And he, in fact, what happens is it goes in about a circular motion. The Home Office actually gets the extradition request and then decides that it is good enough to be passed along to the judiciary. Then the judiciary goes through the extradition request, and then it gets kicked back to the Home Office. So the Home Office, which already said it was a credible extradition request, then signs off on it again, which is why you might expect that most of the time that office isn't going to go against their prior decision where they said, yeah, let's let the judiciary review it. We believe there's some substance behind why he or she should be extradited to this requesting state. So Priti Patel is someone who, right now she's actually in some political hot water, but we won't get into those issues. It seems like every other week there's what?
Over the refugees over Rwanda.
Yeah. She's So what's important for this case and relevant is that, as Declassified UK highlighted, she used to be on the advisory council for the Henry Jackson Society, which has James Woolsey, I believe a former CIA director, is a part of that organization. This is an organization that I haven't really treated credibly, but for the last decade, they've had some of the most fierce and strident messaging against Julian Assange. Definitely a part of that public mobbing campaign. I'm getting some feedback. Definitely a part of that public mobbing campaign that Niels Meltzer called out with his book that he released. So Priti Patel is also an endorser of the expansion of the Official Secrets Acts in the UK. And these laws right now are being there's a widespread consideration within Parliament and other parts of the government to expand it. It'll be an unprecedented expansion, not seen since 1989, and potentially a journalist or a whistleblower, simply for an unauthorized disclosure, for publishing information, like what Julian Assange did, could get up to 14 years in prison as the penalty for being found guilty under the Official Secrets Act if this is expanded. And so we should take that into consideration as well. So with that, we've got a CIA-linked lobby group that Priti Patel was a part of, and then we've got the fact that she's advocating for the expansion of these Official Secrets Acts. And then I'll throw out one more detail, which is that journalists like Matt Kennard at Declassified UK, and then someone like Stefania Marizzi, Italian journalist who I know Rights and Dissent has done panels. I've been on panels with her here to cover developments in the extradition case. When you ask them for information, you just get blocked. They tell you that they don't have it, or they act like some other agency might have it and it's not in their control, even though the Home Office was involved. And the Home Office has absolutely done that in this case. They were involved in something called Operation Pelican. Operation Pelican is the pressure campaign to seize Julian Assange and get him to leave the Ecuador embassy. And the Home Office had at least 8 people, according to an answer to a question that was put to a member of Parliament. And that's one of the few ways that there's been any transparency on this case, because freedom of information requests have been entirely frustrated. But it was said that, well, we don't know where this information is. It's not in our custody. That's what the Home Office is representing, even though 8 people from the Home Office were involved in this operation. And so you have opaqueness, secrecy, and then you have the links to the US government, and you also have the advocacy against press freedom. It doesn't look good. So that's where we go in the direction of the best way to save Julian Assange is shame. And that's been the case for the US when it comes to the Biden White House and the Biden Justice Department. If they want to show that they're independent, that the UK government actually is capable of making decisions that are not beholden to the US government's coercion, intimidation, pressure, etc., then that was the moment for Priti Patel to prove that she's an independent operator. And if she isn't, then it's going to be pretty clear when that request goes back to the district court.
The Henry Jackson Society was also involved in a notorious smear campaign against Noam Chomsky to try to promote the idea that he was a genocide denier in order to undermine his criticisms of the Iraq and Afghanistan war, to the point where when The Guardian had to retract an article featuring a fabricated quote that Chomsky did not say, but that was in there, that they launched a campaign to have that retraction overturned. And it was revealed sometime afterwards that this was a very systematic campaign. So Henry Jackson Society is involved in a lot of bad stuff against critics of US and UK foreign policy. Kevin, if Assange is extradited to the US, what can we expect?
We can expect that Julian Assange will have a very difficult time with a free trial, a fair trial. He'll get a free trial. Everyone gets a free trial in the United States. But the trial will be one in which it's very difficult for him to defend why the documents were published in the first place. It'll be the case that his lawyers will have a hard time putting on the record many details that have actually been aired in court during the extradition hearings. We've heard about UC Global. We've heard about alleged involvement of the CIA in planning to kidnap or even kill, sketching out these war plans, which were detailed by Yahoo News. We've heard about the FBI seizing an archive that Julian Assange had, confiscating it, through the the Ecuadorian authorities handed it over to the FBI after he was removed from their embassy by British police. We've heard all of these details. We've heard things related to the politicization of this case, and we've heard evidence of how journalists worked with WikiLeaks and the process that was undergone, and how there were standard news gathering practices that were followed, and that this was journalism, and that it wasn't somebody who was trying to just attack the United States and undermine it, that the publication of this material was to expose war crimes and torture, diplomatic misconduct and corruption, that there were partnerships with media organizations globally. And yet, if the trial is held, all that will matter are the key allegations about what he did or didn't do with Chelsea Manning when they were allegedly communicating with each other about these documents that were published in 2010 and 2011. That had a tremendous impact that you can fill entire shows doing discussions about the impact, the positive impact these materials have had. So that's what we can expect. We can expect that he'll feel just like what Daniel Hale felt, drone whistleblower, the way that John Kiriakou felt when he went for a plea agreement and did 30 months in prison, the way that Thomas Drake felt as the sledgehammer was being brought down on him, although that case collapsed against him. And he was accused of retaining information, so it was slightly different, but they tried to nail him and believed he was the source for reporting in the New York Times about the warrantless wiretapping program, which was not true. And we can expect that he'll feel what Reality Winner felt, who went and had one of the longest sentences ever for an unauthorized disclosure and served that time in prison before and then during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so that's what we can feel. The pressure, he will feel that pressure to fold and accept some kind of a plea agreement so that he can serve less time in a prison. And if he does that, then that precedent, and through no fault of his own, we will not have any reason to be angry at him, because that'll be the oppressive system being brought to bear against Julian Assange. But with that precedent, it will be a new era for journalists here in the U.S. when it comes to national security reporting, coverage of military affairs, anything sensitive that the U.S. might want to, say that, hey, if you cover this, we're going to retaliate against you for daring to air this out in public.
Yeah, and I would make one caveat, which is that Julian Assange is a journalist who was never a government employee, who never signed a non-disclosure agreement. So there are unique legal issues in his case. I'm sure the prosecution will try to argue that the precedents they use against Hale, they would use against Snowden, they use against Kiriakou, all hold here. I expect his defense to make a number of legal arguments about why they don't. I don't have much faith in a district judge in the Eastern District of Virginia, but I do think it will be a academically interesting, but from human rights standpoint, horrifying series of events in sort of the pretrial motions that we can expect if he comes to.
However, if I can just add something very quickly about that. Having followed the array of cases under the Espionage Act that stretch all the way back to Obama, numerous defense attorneys have argued that it was these cases were unconstitutional by way of the vagueness and the overbreadth of arguments that are made by prosecutors. They've raised issues that did relate to the First Amendment, and none of those were persuasive to judges in these cases, which says to me that as much as he does have First Amendment rights and should have First Amendment rights, as much as the Constitution should cover Julian Assange if he is put on trial, which, by the way, is not a reality that the Trump administration wanted to entertain. Mike Pompeo actually said outright in his first speech as CIA director that Julian Assange had no First Amendment rights, that he was not a journalist. So that being said, though, there will be a chance for them to put forward pretrial motions. But what I'm really concerned about is that the trials phase will not allow these core matters to be debated or brought before any jury. And I believe, it's tenuous. It's tenuous when you think of it, whether he's going to want a bench trial or a jury trial if we get to there. Because of the district that we're in, the Eastern District of Virginia, it's possible he would fare better with a judge who would just look at the law, which is what was the approach that Chelsea Manning's legal team took, which was to not have a military jury. They preferred having a more sober examination done by a military judge. And it may have paid off because in that case, she was acquitted of aiding the enemy and did not receive a life sentence. And it did make it possible in the future for Barack Obama to commute her sentence. And so these are all these questions that Julian Assange is going to have. And hopefully we don't ever get to that. Yes. Now is the moment. Now is the moment. It says what's next for Julian Assange at the bottom of the screen. Now is the moment that despite all of our cynicism, despite everything we know about this case, now is the time for shows like this, panel discussions like this, having routine and regular attention be given to the case now, especially when we're in this window. This window is a time that we might see an uptick in media coverage, which will be welcomed. I mean, all these new outlets that are going to ask questions about what happens next and start to dig into some of the details related to all of this, I welcome them. Wish they had been here for the last year, 2 years, consistently. But I hope there are more BBC News reports that are covering updates on all of this. And The Guardian gets back into this reporting and finds time for this along with regular coverage of the war in Ukraine. And that all of these things that really are at stake here are shared and discussed for the public that needs to recognize what will happen. We always say that civil liberties organizations, human rights organizations, and press freedom organizations, including this one, the rights defending rights and dissent, are aligned against this case, have organized coalitions to challenge the prosecution of Julian Assange. But I don't know how much of the public really knows that, understands the unanimous nature of the opposition and the fact that the Biden White House continues to defy it, and that the UK government, by considering this extradition request seriously, is defying it. And I think it's time for those voices to be further amplified. Not that we can't hear from WikiLeaks people themselves, like Kristen Harafson, the spokesperson, or Stella Assange and all of them, but we really need those arguments that lay out all the issues from people who are objective. And again, I'm not saying we need to dismiss Stella and them, but the people that are really going to hold, I think, sway over everyone are those who can lay out the issues right now from a civil liberties and human rights standpoint and make it clear that this is a really, really bad road to continue down.
Yeah, and those organizations have spoken out. They have not been heard everywhere they need to be heard. I think one of the things that the reason for this is that, someone who's been privy to these inside meetings, and hopefully I'm not saying something I'm not supposed to be saying, so much of the attention has been on Merrick Garland thus far, and getting Merrick Garland to, drop the charges when he is the one who ultimately has that power, that you do see this sort of lack of awareness about this with other decision makers, including a lot of members of Congress. If you just go into their offices, they've never heard of the press freedom letter, even that was a major New York Times story. Some of them don't even know Assange is indicted under the Espionage Act, if you can believe that. So there is a tremendous amount of work to be done to educate members of Congress about this. If you're watching this in the United States, I strongly encourage you to write and call your member of Congress and tell them that Julian Assange is being indicted under the Espionage Act, to encourage them to read the press freedom letters, and to just really remind them of why this case is important, because many people in Congress aren't speaking up not because they're malicious, and there's a lot of malicious people in Congress, but because they literally do not know this is happening, and they need to hear about it, not just from Defending Rights and Dissent, not just from Kevin, not just from the ACLU and Amnesty International, but they need to hear about it from people in their districts, constituents in their districts, because otherwise they're going to say, how is this an issue that I should get involved in? There's a high risk in going against the DOD, the FBI, the CIA, I think NSA too, and every single other agency that's been involved in the persecution of Assange, and low reward if none of my constituents are paying attention. But if they hear from people in their district that press freedom is important to me, and the ACLU and Defending Rights and Dissent and Amnesty International are saying this case is an unprecedented attack on our First Amendment rights, and I want you to speak up. I want you to tell Merrick Garland to drop the charges. I want you to tell Joe Biden to pursue a pardon. I want you to agree to co-sponsor any legislation that could be introduced that would amend the Espionage Act to make it more difficult, if not impossible, to prosecute journalists and publishers like Assange, and hopefully, and this is always the sticking point, to defend sources like Chelsea Manning and Daniel Hale. And they really need to be hearing from you right now if you're in the United States. Kevin, where can people find out more information about your work?
Yes, if you go to thedissenter.org, that's where you can find the newsletter, including the latest report on today's order from the Westminster Magistrates Court. And then I'm on Twitter at Gosztola for regular updates. And yeah, that's the easiest way to follow this coverage of WikiLeaks and then other related connected whistleblower stories.
I also have the misfortune of being on Twitter at ChipGibbons89, and you can follow Defending Rights and Dissent on Twitter at RightsDissent. And please visit us online at rightsanddissent.org. We have multiple actions you can take about Assange and the Espionage Act, but we're not promoting them today because everyone on our list who has seen them about 10 different times. But we have been covering this case since December 2010. I literally have the newsletter from December 2010 in front of me. It was a print newsletter, if you can imagine a newsletter coming in the mail and reading it as opposed to going to a website. Lead story, campaign against WikiLeaks. It discusses censorship, prosecution, and legislation. A month after that, actually a couple weeks after that newsletter was published, we went down to Quantico. We were not invited, but we came anyways, and we organized the first protest calling for Chelsea Manning to be freed. At that time, she was held at Quantico, being tortured by the U.S. government. So we have been on this case for 13 years. We have been in the halls of Congress, educating members of Congress about the Espionage Act broadly. We've talked to them not just about Assange's case, but we've brought people who have represented other clients under the Espionage Act to discuss how difficult these cases are to try. We've started a podcast called primarysourcespodcast.org. Kevin has been a guest where he lays out is it a 13-year war on WikiLeaks, or is it longer than that? And a very long war on WikiLeaks. And, we have been consistently giving people updates on the legal proceedings. We've consistently been advocating on Capitol Hill, and we've been consistently connecting grassroots activists who are angry and upset about what is happening with their members of Congress. So I would strongly encourage you to visit rightsanddissent.org and learn how to get involved in this fight. Kevin, I don't know how many of these broadcasts you've done now. It's always a pleasure to see you. Do you have any final thoughts?
Well, if I could just add very quickly, it's a midterm election. You're going to see people who are representatives in Congress, senators, or part of the House. And if you get to see them out in the wild and ask questions of them, it's a great moment. It's always a good time to ask them about Julian Assange. And we'll just leave it at that.
If I was allowed to have a member of Congress, I would definitely, if I saw her in public, make a comment to her. But I am in DC, so I have no representative. Thank you so much for joining us. The one last thing I would stress is that Julian Assange's health is in precarious conditions. We know that if he is brought to the U.S., he will be held in the Alexandria Detention Center. Defending Rights in Dissent has done advocacy around the conditions of other whistleblowers in that detention center, including Chelsea Manning and Daniel Hale. And we know, based on the text of what the U.S. has assured the U.K. government, these are the assurances that overcame the magistrate's objection to the type of treatment he'd be subjected to, that they violate international law, they violate the Mandela rules for prisoners, and they constitute cruel, degrading, and inhuman treatment, if not torture. So the only thing the U.S. has assured the British government is that if he comes to the U.S., they will quite likely torture him. And even those assurances, the extent of the torture, most people will tell you are not worth the paper they're written on. Thank you for joining us today. I wish it was under better news, but I will end with one last thing. When we were doing the clemency drive for Chelsea Manning, people told me not to do it. Obama would never grant her commutation. And I said, no. I actually didn't think he was going to do it, but I said, we have to fight this. Chelsea Manning is a political prisoner. She deserves our support. And we poured letters into the White House, and she's free.
Never would have imagined that Judge Baretzer would block the decision initially back in January 2021.
As a friend of mine likes to say, when we fight, we don't always win, but when we don't fight, we don't win. Thank you so much for joining us. Defending Rights in Dissent will continue to defend your right to know and freedom to act. Visit us on the web at rightsindissent.org for more updates on the Assange persecution.